Reich-Sprech for physicists. Attempt of an approximation to the weatherwork according to Wilhelm Reich. In two previous articles, Harald Kautz-Vella has explained how radioactivity blocks the life energy, the Reich's organ, and leads to desertification. He also showed, based on the work of the Algerian Madjid Abdellaziz, how this blockade can be dissolved with near-natural organ technology. What seems to be magic can be explained with the latest scientific findings. Reich-Sprech for physicists by Harald Kautz-Vella. Gorik. Research into the energy of life has always been the domain of private researchers, outsiders who often came up with innovative technologies, but who generally found it difficult to keep up with established physics and its nomenclature. So the answers to the question, what is actually orgone and door? These forms of the building and dismantling forces of nature, described by Wilhelm Reich, have always turned out rather unsatisfactory so far. The esoterics nod and say that this is the same as prana, chi, or vril, which leaves the physically trained mind no less perplexed. Yet, it is not at all difficult to place Reich at the feet of established field physics, even if one has to fall back on exotics such as longitudinal, scalar, and torsion fields. But let us start with the simple things. The Earth is bombarded from space with ionizing radiation. When the particles penetrate the upper layers of the atmosphere, ozone or trioxygen O3 is created, while other parts of the radiation only develop their ionizing effect when they hit the Earth's surface. The result is electrostatic charging. In good weather, the ground receives an excess of electrons and is negatively charged, while the atmosphere is positively charged. This is called the Earth's electrostatic field. But on closer inspection, it is not so static, because in this field, different Earth-spanning wave patterns are formed. The intersections of these waves form grid lines that envelop the Earth with all 5 platonic solids, figures 1 and 2. Altogether, this part of electromagnetism, in addition to the normal dipole field, is responsible for 14 to 16% of the measurable Earth's magnetic field, with the oscillations running in the north and south direction being responsible here, whereas the equatorial ones are usually extinguished as standing waves. Extinction is obtained when a clockwise and an anti-clockwise wave are exactly in antiphase. Nevertheless, these waves continue to exist in the form of a longitudinal wave that cannot be measured conventionally. Vibrations that run around the Earth are stable if they connect harmoniously to themselves again after one revision. On a spherical surface, there were a limited number of mathematical solutions to this problem, which can be represented by the platonic solids. On the edges of the platonic solids are the nodes of the oscillation, on the surfaces of the antinodes. All 5 platonic solids are manifested in this form in the oscillation field of the Earth. Towards the top, a complex pattern emerges. Along the dotted line, the platonic solids are constantly being reproduced at different heights. In-phase waves reinforce each other. Opposite phase waves cancel each other out. Cloudy. It can't rain from a blue sky. It needs a cloud. This cloud consists of fine water droplets or tiny ice crystals. For a cloud to form, the humidity must be just over 100%, and at the same time, electrically charged condensation nuclei, such as dust particles, aerosols, or even cosmic radiation must be present in sufficient density. If heated air rises, it cools down, and the air humidity can rise to over 100%. If water vapor condenses, heat is released, and the air can rise even further. This means that clouds can form even at a height of 13 kilometers. Each type of cloud, the International Cloud Atlas lists 10 types such as cirrus, stratus, or cumulus, has its own formation conditions, which are not yet fully understood. Complex frequency mix. The platonic solid creates a complex, inherently harmonious mix of frequencies, the best-known representative being the Schumann frequency. The fundamental equatorial frequency, 11.75 Hz, times 2/3 gives the Schumann frequency. This means that the equatorial and Schumann frequency are in the ratio of 1/5 to each other. Figuratively speaking, one could say, the atmosphere is a spherical loudspeaker and hums at all possible natural frequencies. Quite melodic. Back to the image of the static electric field. Heaven and Earth together form a spherical capacitor. The sky, the upper plate, vibrates and sends electromagnetic signals, which, due to the large wavelengths or surface of the platonic solids, hit the Earth as a shock wave, i.e., as a longitudinal field. The Earth's surface is the other, opposite plate. And it also oscillates. If you stick 2 iron rods into the Earth at a distance of 2 meters, you can measure these oscillations as an electric signal with the aid of a measuring device. This signal is also multi-frequency. Here too, the vibrations go around the Earth, so undisturbed that it is no problem to read out the 60 Hz of the American power supply network in Germany at the same strength as the European 50 Hz. When does harmony prevail? At the latest here, at the technical frequencies, one can see that the oscillation patterns of the sky and those of the Earth are not necessarily identical. It makes sense, based on established natural science, to ask whether heaven and Earth are in harmony with each other. If they are, if they have the same frequencies and their oscillation patterns, then according to the findings of nonlinear optics, these fields can be superimposed and coupled. 2 longitudinal waves of identical frequency in opposite directions, phase shift of 180 degrees, form a scalar wave. The energy content of both fields cancel each other out, i.e., the energy is pressed into the quantum vacuum. The weaker of the 2 waves becomes the so-called phase conjugate replica wave, i.e., it behaves like a normal wave running backwards in time, and thus creates the possibility of spontaneously concentrating electromagnetic potential from the weaker to the stronger potential, figures 6 and 7. Here something happens that is visible in cloud formation every day, but which cannot be understood by simple physics. A place of high potential combines with a place of low potential and sucks its further empty, thereby gaining strength, and sucks it even more strongly. Just like a passive Helmholtz resonator, the sound absorber box picks up the annoying natural frequency of the sound studio from the room by coupling the wave packets and then sucks it away until it runs out. Basically, simple acoustics, fully understood and applied in the field of sound, another longitudinal wave, but hardly understood in the field of the electromagnetic fields of the sky. Quote, "Every increase in potential differences in the sky leads to a livelier weather pattern and usually to rain." From the Laboratory for Nonlinear Optics of Professor Ivan Biagio, Lehigh University. Image of a conical wave from the field of nonlinear optics. Scalar fields are measurable. For a long time, the scalar fields thus created were considered to be unmeasurable. But in fact, they are. Although they do not produce electromagnetic induction, they do change the dielectric constant of certain materials, such as quartz, so that the quantitative change in the scalar field can be measured by changing the capacitance of a quartz capacitor. And sometimes, these scalar fields can be seen with the naked eye. In weatherwork, when a flow between two potentials suddenly draws a spiral cloud to the sky, Figure 8, or in a twisted tree trunk that is nothing more than the material expression of a fixed torsional field through which the energetic exchange between heaven and earth takes place. With this background, it is relatively easy to understand the weatherwork with the so-called cloudbuster, according to Reich. The cloudbuster is like an absorber box directed towards the sky, which is grounded on the other side by contact with the groundwater. If I point it at a cloud, i.e., a place of high field density, the fields from the Earth, which vibrates strongly with its surplus of electrons, and the cloud couple and I suck potential from the sky. The cloud loses its potential towards its periphery and dissolves. If I aim close to the cloud, I reduce the potential next to the cloud and increase the potential difference between the cloud and its periphery, with the result that the cloud can suck in even more potential due to the steeper gradient to its surroundings and grows. This is how Reich made rain. Every increase in the potential difference in the sky leads to a livelier weather event and usually to rain. Phase-conjugated wave pairs generate new waveforms: EM transverse wave and anti-phase replica wave, longitudinal wave, longitudinal electromagnetic wave and antiphase replica wave, EM transverse wave and antiphase replica wave, scalar wave, oscillation of the flux density of time without measurable EM component. Figure 6. Generation of the scalar wave according to Tom Bearden in 2 steps. First, 2 counter-rotating transverse waves superimpose to form a longitudinal wave, e.g., when 2 electromagnetic oscillations orbit the Earth in opposite phase and cancel each other out. 2 of these longitudinal waves can form a scalar wave under certain angles, e.g. 180 degrees, a fluctuation of spacetime itself, as it happens with the fields between heaven and earth. Wave and time-reversed replica wave. For example, time-reversed response wave. This possibility becomes interesting if a spatially small, strong vibration source is opposed to a spatially large, weaker vibration source. Then the oscillation of the large, weak source becomes the time-reversed replica wave of the small, strong source, which can accumulate more and more potential. Coupling of the longitudinal waves between cloudbuster and cloud to a common scalar field. The 2 longitudinal waves from cloud and cloudbuster begin to couple when the frequency is identical. Left. The strong source from the cloudbuster's tubes dominates the wave from the cloud and transforms it into a time-reversed replica wave, a wave that behaves as if it were traveling backwards in time, thus increasingly amplifying the scalar potential at the cloudbuster. Right. For a long time, scalar fields were not considered measurable, but in fact, they are. Harmful vibration patterns. A Dor atmosphere is created when heaven and earth are in dissonance, when, as a consequence, the coupling of the fields becomes impossible when the exchange between heaven and earth ceases. An example is desertification, when vegetation disappears and can no longer perform its important meditating function. Then the oscillation patterns typical of the Earth spread in the atmosphere, disrupt the harmony of the oscillation patterns of the sky, and prevent fluctuations and potential buildup. This can be caused, as already mentioned, by a destruction of the planet cover, by direct influence of electrosmog or by the above-ground release of radioactivity, of substances that belong in nature's blueprint underground, where their decomposing forces, as Walter Russell described it, are in the right place and fuel the formation of humus, but not into the atmosphere. To heal such a solidified atmosphere, the door, i.e. the Earth-typical decomposing vibrations, must first be extracted. Only then does it make sense to increase the potential differences in the sky and to revive the weather. So basically, only one decisive question remains open. Where does the water for the rain come from? Let us first look at a natural pattern of origin of a heavy or thunderstorm rain. The prerequisite is warm, humid air near the ground with a relative humidity of over 60% and a temperature gradient of more than 0.65 degrees Celsius per 100 meters of altitude. Under these conditions, the air stratification becomes unstable and the warm, moist air masses rise. In the process, they expand and thus cool down until condensation occurs, provided that there are sufficient aerosols as condensation nuclei. If this is not the case, the air can become up to 800% supersaturated with water vapor before it rains. How rain occurs. The height at which the dew point is reached defines the lower edge of a cloud. As droplets begin to form, the air is additionally heated by the released heat of condensation, thereby expanding even more compared to its surroundings, rising even faster and forming the rain-bringing tower or cumulonimbus clouds with their strong internal updrafts. The clouds grow by sucking in more and more humid air from below. It rains when the water droplets have become so heavy that they fall faster than the updrafts carry them up. The height of rain cloud formation is between 8 and 12 kilometers. The observations made when making rain with cloud patterns follow a completely different pattern, however. The formation of rain clouds starts spontaneously here, sometimes already at an altitude of 800 to 2,000 meters. This is accompanied by a drop in temperature, sometimes with downwinds that can form tornadoes. The difference in weather patterns is clear and raises two questions. How does weather work lead to these drops in temperature, which are clearly not caused by adiabatic expansion, and/or why is there suddenly enough water without the need for expansion by rising to a height of 10,000 meters, which cools the air masses and brings them to the dew point? These questions cannot yet be answered conclusively, but there are promising approaches. Wilhelm Reich himself stressed the role of the ozone. He noted that the ozone content in door-laden atmospheres was high, an observation that was confirmed decades later by measurements in smog. Reich himself assumed that by changing the electrophysical quality of the atmosphere, the ozone dissociates, and the monoatomic oxygen released forms additional water. A recurring phenomenon in weather work, the flow between potential fields in the sky, manifests itself in spiral cloud structures. The drought in Sahel is a consequence of nuclear explosions and uranium mining. The Ronck-Hilsch vortex tube is a device without moving parts, with which gas can be divided into a hot and a cold flow. Pressurized gas is injected tangentially into a vortex chamber and is set into a fast rotation, over 1 million per minute. Due to the high centrifugal forces and other processes that are not yet fully understood, the gas stream is divided into an outer hot and an inner cold stream. The vortex tube was invented in 1933 by the French physicist Georges J. Ronck. the German physicist Rudolf Hilsch improved the design. Blocked aerosols. Anyone who knows the ozone concentrations measured today is likely to smile at this idea, as we are talking about a maximum of 0.3 milligrams per cubic meter. Even if the ozone were to find free hydrogen, the amount of water formed would be negligible. But today, we know a different relationship between ozone and rain formation. Ozone causes the hydroxyl radical to form, and this blocks the aerosols that form the condensation nuclei for rain. This opens the way to a supersaturation of the atmosphere with water vapor, as already mentioned, up to 800% above the dew point. If the ozone formation is successfully inhibited, the aerosols remain active and rain can form again in a saturated atmosphere. How the cloudbuster causes the ozone to transform back into normal oxygen remains to be seen. But this is where the topic of radioactivity comes in. This is because released radionuclides also produce ozone in the lower layers of air with their ionizing radiation, thus inhibiting rain formation by blocking the aerosols. Whether this is the nuclear effect or merely a side effect of the effect at field level is left unanswered here. After all, it is a solid model for explaining the drought in the Sahel zone, which has spread over Africa since the French nuclear tests, and especially since the uranium mines in Niger were commissioned in the 1970s. The thermals of the vortices. However, this approach does not explain by far why spontaneous drops in temperature occur in connection with weather work. The phenomenon that temperatures change without any viable energy input or output is always associated with vortex formation in nature. Water vortices cool down spontaneously to 4 degrees Celsius in the core, collapsing cavitation bubbles filled with water vapor heat up to 40,000 degrees Celsius in the vortex core. And in the Ronck-Hilsch tube, figure 9, an air vortex standing in a cylinder, there is a temperature separation between core and periphery, with temperature differences of up to 120 degrees Celsius. Victor Schauberger's Klimator used a corrugated gold-plated copper disc to generate an air vortex that influenced the water molecules in such a way that they absorbed or emitted infrared radiation depending on the rotational frequency. And so, he was able to cool or heat entire rooms without having to expend energy for this, except, of course, for the constant 200 watts that the electric motor needed to keep the disc rotating. And if one is open for it, also, the encounter with disembodied life energy vortex fields, or Volgo ghosts, according to statements of affected persons, is always accompanied by a cold breeze of air. This would be an explanatory model. Thanks to their vortex characteristics, the resulting scalar fields spontaneously cool the air, which locally leads to drops in temperatures, cool-down winds, condensation of water vapor, cloud formation, and rain from low altitudes. The fine fractal drawings, which show the clouds created by weather work in their formation phase to the sky, would speak for this. Biefeld-Brown effect. There are, however, 3 further mechanisms which are controversial from an academic point of view, but which could be considered as mechanisms of action in their manifestation. The first is the so-called Biefeld-Brown effect. Asymmetrically shaped, electrically charged capacitors experience recoilless acceleration in the direction of the smaller plate, thanks to their highly inhomogeneous electric field. The effect is interesting because it challenges 2 main theorems, the law of conservation of energy and the law of conservation of momentum. Nevertheless, Brown says that he was able to prove the effect in the laboratory, and a whole generation of tinkerers has set a monument to him with their lifts, small missiles that presumably use this effect to fly. Water molecules and hydroxyl ions also form a dipole, or capacitor, with one large O and 1 or 2 small H plates, and a correspondingly inhomogeneous field between them. If these molecules succeed in aligning themselves in space, they accelerate the direction of the H or both H atoms according to the Biefeld-Brown effect. The alignment itself does not require any extra energy, i.e., it is only a question of the self-organization of the water vapor or the hydroxyl ions in the atmosphere, which decides whether the vapor moves in a specific direction and is thus able to concentrate spontaneously locally. This would be a mechanism that could play a role in cloud formation. The second effect that might be of interest first came to my attention when I accepted the challenge for the company Cobra to prove the functionality of the devices in the laboratory as an expert witness in a court case against the company. The device called Cobra consists essentially of 2 copper spirals and is supposed to work on a similar physical level as the Cloudbuster. At that time, I recommended a setup to the company that would make the migration of water under the device visible. Hundreds of pipettes were used, which sprinkled a foam bed. Strangely enough, during Cloudbuster operations, rain does not show any of the typical degeneration phenomenon that all water on Earth has now suffered through our civilization. Wonderful water loss. The experiment itself was rather unsatisfactory, but 2 other effects occurred which caused surprise. The physical quality of the water in the collecting basin changed under the Cobra with the phases of the moon, and on selected days, the water developed such strong cohesive forces that it looked as if it had gelled. A 5 mm deep notch formed at the edge of the vessel. A strengthening of the cohesion forces, the cohesion of the water molecules among themselves, could also play a role in the formation of rain, and water disappeared from some of the sealed pipettes that had been laid out ready. It simply disappeared from closed vessels. I myself fell away from the belief at that time because I had firmly reckoned with an influence of the Cobra on the migration behavior with increased and/or directed adhesion. But sometimes, for example, when it rains again over the Australian continent, I think of the first chapter of Genesis. And the Spirit of God hovered over the waters, and the flood in its early descriptions, where the waters of heaven and earth united. I think of Maddie Pitkin's multi-dimensional Universe 5 and wonder if there isn't a space-time foil in the immediate vicinity. There is a dimensional plane which is completely filled with water, in which the Spirit of God dwells, and from which our reality was once formed. From which, in certain field constellations, the water comes over to us through small or large wormholes. Over Australia, including fish, in the last and perhaps coming flood, and also in Cloudbuster operations, after which the rain, strangely enough, does not show any of the typical degeneration phenomena that all water on Earth has meanwhile suffered through our civilization, but rather produces very pure virgin water, as we would expect from a fountain of youth.